This is a video about how to do problem 10.10 on the difference between two population means, and I'm going to solve the hypothesis test portion, which is part B. So the question tells us that we have the claim that the waiting time for customers at New Century Bank waiting at branches is less than the waiting time at Public Bank. So New Century Bank waiting time less than, I'm just going to call it Public Bank. So we need to assign which group are the ones and which group are the twos in order to think about what we're testing. We're testing if the claim of the management is true. Okay, so if Century Bank is group 1 and Public Bank is group 2, then when mu1 minus mu2 is calculated, it will be negative because this number will be smaller than this number, which turns it negative. So on two population problems, it doesn't just matter that it says less than, it also matters that you think through what happens when we subtract. Notice if we switch them, that the other bank was mu2 versus mu1, it would have changed our alternative hypothesis. So this way we'll determine that Century Bank less than Public Bank. Okay, that's the hypothesis that we're testing. Some of the information given to us relates to each of the sample means, each of the standard deviations, and so on. So it says that at New Century Bank, the average is in the sample, I'm going to list it this way, the sample mean for New Century Bank was 4.5 minutes. Public Bank was an average of 4.75 minutes. We also find out that the population standard deviation at New Century Bank was 1.2 minutes. The population standard deviation at Public Bank was 1.5 minutes. And the sample size for New Century Bank was, we looked at 200 customers, and for Public Bank, 300 customers. So that's the sample information. We're going to use Z because we have at least 30 for both groups, and both population standard deviations are known. Next, it says what level of significance. We should put this up here that we're going to use 2.5% level of significance. Our third step is going to be calculate our test statistic. So we need z-test, comes from x1 bar minus x2 bar, mu1 minus mu2, and then we need in our denominator our weighted average of the two population standard deviations. So I'm going to use some colors here to find things. So we're going to use 4.5 minus 4.75. That came from the sample values. We're going to use 0 because mu1 minus mu2 has 0 in the hypothesis. Notice both of those have to be the same value or it doesn't make sense. And then the denominator is going to have, let's actually use 1.2 and 1.5 are each of our population standard deviations, and then each of our sample sizes comes from here, and these get calculated and then added, so be careful with that denominator. So after you complete that, we are going to find that our z-test statistic will be minus 2.06. So the next step is our formation of our rejection region. Because we have a less than in the alternative hypothesis here, we're going to use a less than over here. So alpha equals 2.5%. So I go to my z-table, or as a trick that we learned in last class, we can look at degrees of freedom equals infinity from t-table to find the z-value. And when we do that, we see we can use negative 1.96. In the t-table, it's going to be positive, but as we discussed, you always need to decide when it's t, which side it belongs on. If it belongs on the left side, it has to turn negative. Okay, so in order to evaluate it, we put in our z-test. This one was z-critical. And we conclude, since z-test is in the rejection region, we say we have shown, what we're showing is the alternative hypothesis. We could also add here, reject the null. We have shown that average wait time for New Century Bank is lower than for Public Bank at 2.5% significance. And just as a reminder, this is not whether the samples are lower, but in the population.